The world belongs to those who scream. The quiet ones are never asked. Like oil rising to the surface, the world is the barrel, and power is what floats. Whoever feeds on what isn't theirs, whoever strips the poor to the bone, whoever bends the truth just beautifully enough, and the world wraps itself around their arm. The man who tears the book of lies, who weighs each soul with honest eyes, who pulls his bread from stone, the world breaks him. Whoever sold the last piece of their name, whoever lit the fire of discord and walked away clean, whoever stands guilty and powerful at the same time, the world stands beside them. But listen, this world stayed with no one. Not with Pharaoh, not with Caesar, not with the kings whose names we carved into stone so we wouldn't forget how completely they were erased. This world is borrowed, every empire, every throne, every system built to keep you exactly where you are, borrowed, and the debt always comes due. The United States government looked at its own citizens, not enemies, not criminals, not soldiers who signed up knowing the risk. Its own people, asleep in their own beds, trusting in their own country, and decided they were raw material. His name was Frank Olson. It's November 1953. He's a husband, a father of 3. He works for the Army. Biological research, nothing glamorous, just a man doing a job in a country he believes in. He's at a work retreat in rural Maryland. There's dinner. There's drinks. There's a small glass of Cointreau passed around the table, and Frank drinks it the way you drink anything at a work dinner, without thinking. Because why would you think? Because you are among colleagues, because this is America. Because no one poisons the Cointreau, except someone did. 9 days later, Frank Olson fell from a 10th floor window in New York City. The government called it a suicide. They would not tell his family what had been in that glass for over 20 years. What was in that glass was LSD, administered without his knowledge, without his consent, without a single word of warning, by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. Frank Olson was not the first. He was not the last. He was just the one whose name we eventually learned. Here is what you need to understand about the world that made this possible.
It is 1950. The Cold War is not a metaphor yet. It is a temperature.
It is the specific chill of watching the Soviet Union detonate its first nuclear bomb a year ahead of schedule and realizing that somewhere, somehow, there is a leak. American intelligence is not just afraid of losing a war. It is afraid of losing the architecture of reality itself. Because the rumor, and the CIA treated rumors like loaded weapons, the rumor was that the Soviets had cracked something. Not a bomb, not a missile. Something quieter. Something that could reach inside the human mind and rearrange the furniture. Brainwashing, thought control. The ability to take a man and turn him into whatever you needed him to be. And the CIA, rather than asking whether this was possible, asked something far more dangerous. They asked, how do we get there first? What came next was not a rogue operation. Do not let anyone sell you that story. This was not a few bad actors in a basement. MK Ultra was approved at the highest levels of CIA leadership, funded through secret channels to hide it from congressional oversight, and farmed out to universities, hospitals, and prisons across the United States and Canada. Institutions you were supposed to trust with your body and your mind. Over 150 research projects, dozens of front organizations, an entire hidden architecture of human experimentation built inside the skeleton of legitimate science. The director who greenlit it was Alan Dulles. The man who ran it on the ground was Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist, a cold warrior, a man who believed that the end of Western civilization justified whatever it cost the people who never got a vote on that question. They were not monsters in the way we like our monsters. They had offices. They had commutes. They had families who loved them. They were monsters in the most American way possible. Bureaucratic, procedural, protected by paperwork and plausible deniability, and the quiet understanding that some things are done so they do not need to be discussed. The subjects they chose were not chosen by accident. They were the already invisible, mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, people whose disappearance, whose deterioration whose death one would not require explanation. And when they needed someone who looked like a normal citizen, someone with a clearance and a family and a glass of Cointreau in his hand, well, Frank Olson had no idea he had been selected. Neither did you. Let's talk about Sidney Gottlieb. Because every machine has an engineer. Every program has a true believer. And MKUltra had Sidney Gottlieb, a man with a chemistry degree from Caltech, a stutter he'd spent his whole life fighting, and an absolute unshakable conviction that he was one of the people holding the line between freedom and the end of everything. He was not a sadist. That's the part that should disturb you most. He composted. He raised goats. He folk danced. He was, by every account from people who knew him personally, a warm and thoughtful man. He just also ran a secret government program that dosed unwitting human beings with hallucinogens, and then watched what happened. And he went home afterward and fed the goats and did not, apparently, lose a single night of sleep. That is not a monster. That is something more dangerous than a monster. That is a man who has been handed a framework, an ideology, an institutional logic, a salary, a title, a chain of command that transforms harm into duty. The CIA did not recruit sadists to run MKUltra. It recruited believers. It recruited men who had seen the enemy and decided that the old rules were a luxury they could not afford. And once you have decided that, once you have drawn that line and stepped over it, the line keeps moving. It always keeps moving. Gottlieb operated under a structure designed to make him untouchable. MKUltra's funding was routed through a private foundation, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, which then distributed grants to universities and research institutions who did not always know, or did not want to know, exactly who was signing the checks or why. This was not an accident. This was architecture. This was a system built to guarantee that if it ever unraveled, the thread would lead somewhere, anywhere other than Langley. And the institutions took the money: Stanford, Columbia, Harvard, the University of Illinois, Johns Hopkins. These were not fringe operations. These were the most trusted names in American science and medicine, and they were cashing checks from the CIA to study how you break a human mind, how far it can bend before it does not come back, what it takes to make a person confident something they did not believe, do something they would never choose, become something they were not. Some of the researchers knew exactly what they were part of. Some told themselves they were doing science, pure, necessary, important science, and the circumstances were just the circumstances. Some probably didn't ask, because not asking was its own form of protection. And then there were the patients. At Tulane University, a neurosurgeon named Robert Heath implanted electrodes directly into human brains. His subjects were psychiatric patients, people who had already been stripped of their autonomy by a system that had decided their minds were problems to be managed rather than lives to be honored. At McGill University in Montreal, a Scottish-born psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron was doing something he called psychic driving, a process so violent in its logic it barely deserves the word therapy. He would chemically induce comas lasting weeks. He would play recorded messages on loops for 20, 30, sometimes 60 days without stopping. He was attempting, he said, to wipe the mind clean and rebuild it from scratch. His patients came to him with depression, with anxiety, with the ordinary fractures of ordinary lives. They left, and when they left, unable to remember their own names, unable to recognize their children, unable to perform tasks a toddler could manage. Women in their 30s who had to be taught again how to use a toilet. Men who had been professionals, fathers, functioning people, reduced, erased, not accidentally, not as a side effect, but as the point. Erasure was the method. Erasure was the product. Cameron received CIA funding through the Front Foundation. He received it for years. He never told his patients who was paying for what was being done to them. He was at the time one of the most respected psychiatrists in North America, president of the American Psychiatric Association. president of the World Psychiatric Association. Awards on his wall, papers in the journals, colleagues who admired him. The machine does not run on villains. The machine runs on prestige and paperwork and the institutional amnesia of everyone who knows just enough to be useful and just little enough to keep their conscience quiet. Back in Washington, Gottlieb kept expanding. The LSD experiments broadened. They moved out of hospitals and into bars. The CIA set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York, hired sex workers to lure men in off the street, dosed them without warning, and watched from behind one-way mirrors while operatives took notes. The project had a name. They called it Operation Midnight Climax, and I want you to sit with that name for a moment. The complete contempt embedded in it, the arrogance of men who were so certain of their own impunity that they could name their crimes like cocktails. No one said stop. Not because no one knew, because the knowing was the point, and the power was the proof, and the proof was this, that they could look at another human being and see not a person, but a variable. And they were right. For 20 years, they were completely right. Every empire thinks it will be the exception. Every system built in the dark believes it has built the dark well enough, sealed it, staffed it, funded it, insulated it with enough layers of deniability that the light will never find the seam. And for 20 years, the CIA was right. MKUltra ran. The experiments continued. The subjects suffered and deteriorated, and in some cases died, and the program did not slow down, did not self-correct, did not produce a single internal voice loud enough to stop the machine from the inside. What stopped it was not conscience. What stopped it was paperwork. In 1973, Richard Helms, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, a man who had spent his career understanding that information is the only currency that actually mattered, ordered the destruction of MKUltra's files. Not some files, not the sensitive ones, all of them. Helms was leaving his post. A new director was coming in, and somewhere in the calculation of a man who had built his entire life around controlling what other people knew, the files became a liability too large to carry forward. The shredders ran. Thousands of documents, gone. The clinical records, the experiment logs, the names of the subjects, the names of the institutions, the paper trail that connected Sydney, Gottlieb's goat farm to the women at McGill who could no longer remember their own children, gone. Helms would later testify before Congress that he had ordered the destruction because the files were, in his word, distasteful. That is the word he chose, distasteful, as though the problem with what had been done was the paperwork it generated. This is what impunity looks like when it is wearing a suit. But Helms made one mistake. Or rather, the system made one mistake. The mistake that every system eventually makes, which is that it trusted itself completely and therefore did not check everywhere. In 1977, a CIA archivist conducting a routine search discovered a cache of documents that had survived the purge. They had been misfiled, stored in a records facility in Warrenton, Virginia, under a financial audit classification that put them outside the sweep of Helms' order, roughly 20,000 pages. Not everything, not even close to everything, but enough to see the shape of the machine. The documents landed in the hands of journalist Seymour Hersh, who had already broken the My Lai massacre, who already understood that the distance between what governments say and what governments do is not a gap but a canyon. And then they landed in front of the Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee that had been convened to investigate CIA abuses. And Senator Frank Church held up what he had been handed and called it what it was. He called it a rogue elephant. He was wrong about that, and the wrongness matters. A rogue elephant is an accident. A rogue elephant is a system that went off the rails. MKUltra did not go off the rails. MKUltra was the rails. It was designed, approved, funded, expanded, and protected by the leadership of the United States intelligence community for over 2 decades, and Calling it rogue was the first move in the longest con of the entire story, which was the con of making the American public believe that what had happened was an aberration rather than a policy. The hearings were televised. The testimony was damning. Gottlieb testified wearing dark glasses and using a pseudonym. His real name, he argued, would endanger his life. He invoked the Cold War. He invoked necessity. He said the words that men in his position always say, which is that you have to understand the context. You have to understand what we were facing. You have to understand that we were trying to protect something. No one in that room asked the patients at McGill whether they had consented to be the price of that protection. No one asked the men in the San Francisco safe houses whether they had agreed to be variables in a federal experiment. No one asked Frank Olson's children, who were watching all of this on television, who were learning for the first time what had been in their father's glass, who were learning that the government had known and hidden it and sent a representative to their mother's door with condolences and a lie. No one asked them what they understood the word protection to mean. The families of the dead did not get answers. They got acknowledgement, which is what power offers when it cannot afford to offer justice. A senator saying the word rogue, a director who was gone already, a chemist who would retire to a cabin in Vermont and spend his final years doing volunteer medical work in India, as though the ledger of a human life can be balanced by addition alone. The program was over. The men who ran it were alive and free. And the question, the only question that has ever mattered, was already being quietly, efficiently, institutionally buried. If they did it then, what are they doing now? Here is what justice looked like. In 1977, the Senate hearings concluded. Reports were written. Recommendations were issued. The CIA agreed to new oversight structures. Committees were formed to ensure something like this could never happen again. Everybody went home. No one was charged. No one was tried. No one went to prison. Sidney Gottlieb was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. Richard Helms was fined $2,000 for lying to Congress and $2,000 and received a standing ovation from CIA employees when he walked back into the building. The institutions that took the money, universities and hospitals, that provided the laboratories, the patients and the legitimacy, issued no apologies, made no reparations, and in most cases continued operating with the same names on the same buildings you can still visit today. The survivors fought for decades. The Canadian victims, the patients of Ewan Cameron, the ones who lost years of their lives and the structure of their own minds, eventually sued the CIA in 1988. 9 of them received settlements of roughly $750,000 split between them. The United States government admitted no wrongdoing. That is the formula. That is always the formula. Here is a number. Here is a check. Here is the silence we are purchasing with it. Frank Olson's family exhumed his body in Santiforter. Forensic examination found evidence inconsistent with a fall, injuries suggesting he had been struck before going through that window. The case was never prosecuted. It remains officially unsolved. His son Eric has spent his entire adult life asking for the truth. He is still asking. And here is where the specific story ends and the real story begins. Because MKUltra was not a failure of the system. It was a product of it. It was what the system looks like when it is working exactly as designed, only when secrecy is total, oversight is theater, and the people deciding what is permissible have already decided that permissible means whatever they can hide. The question is never whether power will abuse the people beneath it. The question is only how long it takes for the paperwork to surface. And the answer every declassified document in every archive keeps delivering is long enough. Long enough for the architects to retire. Long enough for institutions to rebrand. Long enough for the word rogue to replace the word policy in the public record. You were not supposed to know about MKUltra. You know only because of filing error in a records facility in Virginia in 1977 placed 20,000 pages in the wrong drawer. The truth did not win. The truth got lucky, and luck is not a system. Luck is not oversight. Luck is not justice. This is what power has always known, and what the rest of us keep having to relearn. They do not need to silence everyone. They only need to outlast everyone who remembers.